Hi, Holly. So I heard that you said we could do a makeup or a extra video about Dwight Conkergood's Rethinking Ethnography. So I'm going to do this in case the weekend that I have to go to my best friend's bachelorette party, I need to skip. Yeah. I'm talking about Dwight Conkergood's Rethinking Ethnography. So just kind of generally, this article is talking about the performative politics of embodied inquiry and why we do embodied performance, particular to ethnography. So Conkergood in this article is against logical empiricism, and the aim of this piece is to try to encourage audiences, readers, and scholars of ethnography and of performance to go beyond this participant-observer position and to think of themselves as co-performers. So this at its heart is a call for embodied research. So there's four intersecting themes in the critical rethinking of ethnography. They are the return of the body, boundaries and borderlands, the rise of performance, and rhetorical reflexivity. So I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. So return of the body, what's the importance there? Well, this is performance studies research, so the body is going to be privileged, the body is going to be the site of knowledge. So participant observation privileges, again, the body as a site of knowing, and this is comes out of this mind-body hierarchy where the mind is always privileged, but there is this important call and necessity to remember that the body is also a site of knowledge, and ethnography is an embodied practice. So, although ethnographic fieldwork privileges the bodies, there's a bit of a tension here because published ethnographies typically repress the bodily experience in favor of theory and analysis, which for me personally is difficult since I am so much more interested in the experience of the body on the ground and retelling what that experience is like. So in ethnography, like, when you privilege the body, you're also kind of privileging the doing of ethnography. So there's those sensory modes of experience, and those should be meaningful, but they tend to get suppressed under academic discourse. So he begins talking about, in this section, that the rethinking of ethnography is really about speaking and listening instead of observing. So it's really challenging those visualist biases. So it's got to be, if it's about the body, then it's about speaking and listening. It can't just be about this observation, this objectifying gazing. So sight and surveillance, that gaze, that objectifying vision is really dependent upon detachment and distance, and that's kind of the opposite of what we want to do whenever we are considering the body. So he says one of the important things about this is because vulnerability and self-disclosure are enabled through conversations, and those are functions of the body. So we have to return to the body in the rethinking of ethnography. Boundaries and borderlands is the second topic of discussion here. So in ethnography, there's this preoccupation with marginal cultures, right? And he's trying to say that borders don't always just contain, they also bleed. And so boundaries need to be understood as crisscrossing sites. They don't just need to be understood as these linear dividing sites between people and between populations and between lines of thoughts, because these things bleed. They don't just contain. So categories always leak. So we want to kind of think of this more as like bridges, these boundaries as bridges and membranes, other than like containing vessels. So he wants us to move away from borderlands, and he wants us to rethink identity and culture as constructed and relational instead of given and essential. And so that's really key here, is that this more kind of dialogic performance and interaction that Conkergood is always discussing. And important here is to remember that he's saying that meaning is contested in between structures, and that in-betweenness is important too. So it's all about process, and identity is process, performance is process, and it's ongoing. And it's always politically contested and historically unfinished, but it is a process, and it is ongoing. So we get this kind of betwixt and betweenness when we're discussing boundaries and borderlands, and these ideas of them leaking and crossing over and being bridges to one another and being like membranes. So, and that also, these boundaries and borderlands are sites of knowledge, because they can also be places in which people can recollect and recontextualize and refashion their identities. And so just like identity is a process, those processes of kind of discovering and recreating identity can be done in those boundaries. Yeah, they're just cool. So again, we move on to the third, which is the rise of performance. So we have this renewed appreciation for boundaries, and it's interesting, he notes, that ethnographers have turned to a performance-inflected vocabulary. Victor Turner kind of, in a way, paved the way for this and opened up this space for ethnography in performance. And the way he kind of did this was talking about language of drama and performance, and that gave him a way to think and talk about people as actors who creatively play, they improvise, they interpret, and they represent roles and scripts. So when we're talking about performance-centered research, we take the body that's situated in time and place and history as both the method and the subject matter. And this, again, because it's privileging the body, insists on face-to-face interaction. So the ethnographer has to be a co-performer in order to understand embodied meanings. So if you are privileging the body as a site of knowledge, like Concord Good says to do in the first place, then whenever you are considering the rise of performance, you have to consider how those bodies perform. You have to understand embodied meaning and social scripts and dramas and performances. You also here need to consider that there are cultural performances that are done collectively, and people construct and participate in these performances. So it would really be a mistake, he says again, to privilege words over other channels of meaning. The rethinking, so this kind of requires us to rethink the world as text to the world as performance, which is what this move to rise of performance is really encouraging, because that opens up new questions, and they can be the new questions that opens up for us. There's 5 of them. So performance and cultural process is the first, and that's encouraging us to think about culture as a process instead of a product. There's performance and ethnographic praxis, which encourages to remember that fieldwork is a collaborative performance of the observer and the observed. The third is performance and hermeneutics, which encourages to remember and ask questions about what kinds of knowledge are privileged or displaced when performance becomes a way of knowing. Fourth is performance and scholarly representation, which is asking about performance as complementary or alternative forms of publishing. So what are kind of the consequences or privileges of hearing voices from the field interpretively and not directly, so bringing back information as performance and as embodied instead of publishing that research, instead of documenting that in words, but doing it through the body. And then there's the politics of performance, which is asking questions about the relationships between performance and power, and how performance reproduces, sustains, challenges, subverts, critiques, and enables different ideologies. So he talks about that it's one thing to talk about performance as a model for cultural process, but it's like there's always this, it's like, okay, yeah, like sure, you can perform the information that you discovered as an ethnographer, but as long as it gets written up later, like as long as it gets published later. And so he really wants here to encourage that the bodily experience of doing fieldwork and performing fieldwork is important, not just the writing and the publication of that. So then he goes into talk about rhetorical reflexivity. So this is about kind of when we have to rethink ethnography, a lot of this has been empowered previously by rhetorical critique of anthropological discourse. But here, he's kind of saying that ethnography on the page as written constrains and shapes performance in the field. But he also thinks that it's important and true to remember that experiential performance sometimes resists and exceeds and overwhelms the constraints of writing. So yeah, like there may be some privileges to writing things and publishing things down, especially considering performance's ephemerality, but at the same time there's things that are lost whenever you do write things down instead of performing them, and there's things that when you do perform that kind of can be more effective than the writing. So rhetorical reflexivity has helped ethnography in the sense that it gives this, it kind of fills this gap between engaging others where they are and representing them where they aren't. So ethnographic authority is an empowering alignment between rhetorical strategy and political ideology. So those are kind of Conquer-Good's, I know I went through that really quickly, but the importance of rethinking ethnography is something that is embodied, that the body is a site of knowledge, that we need to reconceptualize the way that we think about borders and boundaries of marginal cultures, and that these things bleed, and that identity can often be shaped at that site, and it's not at that location of these bridges or these membranes, and that we have to remember that forming of identity is always a process. And then also just encouraging us to think about ethnography in performance terms. So this rise of performance in ethnography is important because the body is a site of knowing. We have to remember to privilege that. But then also how that brings up complications with publishing research in like paper and text format, and the difference between performing that research through the body on stage, which is necessarily ephemeral, although you can document that through film, but considering those tensions as well. And then also remembering how you have to be, in rhetorical reflexivity, how you have to be reflexive about the language that you are using whenever you are producing a text. So to be self-conscious and to be reflexive about the text that you are producing is also important still. So that is Conquer-Good's Rethinking Ethnography.